Something strange happens when you look closely at people who reach their late 90s and beyond. It isn't that they suddenly change their lives at 80. It's the opposite. They keep doing the same quiet things they've done for decades. They keep moving. They keep showing up for people. They keep finding small reasons to get out of bed. And almost none of them would call it a strategy. When researchers study the oldest adults, the surprising part isn't what these people start doing late in life. It's what they refuse to stop doing. Not everywhere, not in every person, and never as a guarantee. But the pattern is hard to ignore. Here's the thing most people miss. Living to 100 is not really about adding empty years. The years that matter are the ones where you can still walk to the kitchen, still follow a conversation, still take care of yourself. Doctors sometimes call this health span, the stretch of life spent in good function as opposed to lifespan, the total number of years. And when you study people who stay independent into their 90s, one thing stands out. They tend to hold on to certain habits long after most people let them go. And that gap between lifespan and health span is bigger than most of us realize. Plenty of people spend their final decade or more dependent on others, unable to do the ordinary things that make a day feel like their own. So the real question isn't just how to add years, it's how to add years worth living in. Now, there's an obvious problem here, and it's worth naming early. People who live past 100 are survivors. They made it through wars, illnesses, and decades of risk that took many others. So when we notice what they do, we can't always tell whether the habit helped them get there or whether being unusually healthy let them keep the habit. That's a real limitation, and we'll come back to it. But even with that caution, these patterns show up often enough across very different cultures and very different lives that they're worth understanding. Not to copy blindly, to understand what functional aging actually looks like from the inside. Number 1. They never stop moving. This is probably the most consistent pattern in the whole picture, and it almost never looks like exercise. Picture an 88-year-old who still hangs laundry outside, walks to a neighbor's house, sweeps the front step, and tends a small garden. She wouldn't say she works out. She'd say she has things to do. And that distinction matters more than it sounds. In long-lived communities around the world, from rural Japan to parts of the Mediterranean, researchers keep noticing the same thing. The oldest adults tend to have movement built into ordinary life rather than scheduled into a gym hour. Their days involve standing up, bending down, carrying things, and walking short distances again and again. The science here is reasonably strong. Regular physical activity is one of the most consistent factors linked with lower risk of disability and death across large studies. But notice the word linked. Much of this comes from observational research, meaning studies that track people over time without assigning who moves and who doesn't. So we can't prove that movement alone bought those extra years. What we can say is that staying active is associated with keeping strength, balance, and independence, and that the people who reach very old age in good shape almost never spent their later decades sitting still. Number 2, they never stop challenging their legs. Moving is one thing. Keeping actual strength is another, and it's easy to lose without noticing. There's a process called sarcopenia, the gradual loss of muscle mass and strength that comes with age. It speeds up after 60, and for many people, it quietly steals the ability to climb stairs, stand up from a low chair, or catch themselves during a stumble. Here's what stands out about people who stay independent into their 90s. They keep asking their legs to do hard things, not weightlifting, necessarily, but rising from the floor, walking up a slope, carrying groceries, squatting down to reach a low shelf. In many traditional settings, people sit and rise from the floor countless times a day, and that repeated effort keeps the lower body working. Strength and power in the legs turn out to matter enormously for daily life, because they're what let you stay mobile and avoid falls. And falls are one of the biggest threats to independence in older age. The evidence that resistance-style effort helps preserve muscle is actually fairly solid, including from controlled trials, where researchers assign the activity and measure the result. Of course, for someone with balance problems, heart disease, or joint pain, the safe version of this looks different, and it's worth talking through with a clinician before making a big change. Number 3. They never stop showing up for other people. If you asked most centenarians to name their longevity secret, very few would mention friendship. But social connection is one of the most striking patterns researchers find. The oldest adults tend to stay woven into a web of people: family, neighbors, a small circle they see often. They have someone to eat with, someone to talk to, someone who'd notice if they didn't show up. Loneliness, by contrast, has been linked in large studies with worse health outcomes, including higher risk of heart problems and cognitive decline. Some researchers have even compared the health effect of chronic isolation to well-known physical risks, though it's worth being careful with those comparisons, because it's hard to untangle cause and effect. Lonely people may be lonely partly because they're already unwell. Still, the direction is consistent enough that most experts now treat connection as a genuine part of healthy aging, not a soft extra. And here's the part that's easy to miss. The connection doesn't have to be big. It's often just regular, small, and reliable. The same faces, the same short conversations, a reason to be expected somewhere. In some long-lived communities, people belong to tight, lifelong groups that check on one another and share responsibilities, so no one drifts into isolation as they age. You don't need a formal version of that. But the underlying idea, staying reliably connected to a few people who will notice you, seems to matter more than any grand social life. Number 4. They never stop having a reason to get up in the morning. On the Japanese island of Okinawa, people talk about ikigai, a word that roughly means the thing that makes life worth living. In parts of Costa Rica, older adults describe something similar: a plan de vida, a reason to keep going. These aren't grand missions. Often it's caring for a grandchild, tending animals, finishing a small daily task, or simply being needed. What's interesting is that a sense of purpose keeps appearing when researchers study the oldest and most functional adults. In several long-term studies, people who reported a stronger sense of meaning tended to live longer and stay sharper, even after accounting for some other factors. Now, we have to be honest about what that does and doesn't prove. Purpose is hard to measure, and people who feel purposeful may also be healthier, wealthier, or more connected to begin with. So this is more a promising pattern than a proven lever you can pull, but it fits with something we understand about human beings. Having a reason to get up tends to keep you moving, engaged, and connected, and those things carry their own benefits. The people who stay vital into their 90s rarely describe themselves as retired from life. They still have something that expects them. Number 5. They never stop using their minds. There's an old and comforting myth that the aging brain simply winds down and there's nothing to be done. The reality is more hopeful and more nuanced. Some cognitive change with age is normal: a little slower recall, a bit more effort to learn new names. That's different from dementia, which is a disease process, not a guaranteed part of getting old. People who stay mentally sharp into very old age tend to keep their brains busy in ordinary ways. They read, play cards, do puzzles, manage their own affairs, learn new skills, tell long stories, and argue about the news. The idea researchers sometimes describe is cognitive reserve, the brain's ability to keep functioning by drawing on a lifetime of mental activity and building alternate pathways. The evidence linking mental engagement, and especially education earlier in life, with lower dementia risk is reasonably consistent. But causation is genuinely murky here. It's possible that a healthy brain is simply more inclined to stay curious, rather than the curiosity protecting the brain. What we can say fairly is that staying mentally active is linked with better cognitive aging. It carries almost no downside, and it tends to travel alongside the other habits on this list. Connection, purpose, and movement, which may matter just as much for the brain. Number 6. They never stop eating in a simple, steady way. There's no single magic food behind long life, no matter how many videos promise one. When you look across long-lived populations, what stands out isn't a superfood. It's a pattern. Meals tend to be built around plants, beans, vegetables, grains, with meat and heavy processed food playing a smaller role. Portions are often modest, and crucially, people eat on a fairly regular rhythm rather than grazing on snacks all day. In Okinawa, there's a well-known phrase, hara hachi bu, a reminder to stop eating when you're about 80% full. It's a cultural habit, not a prescription, but it captures something real about not constantly overeating. The evidence for plant-forward eating patterns and better long-term health is fairly strong, drawn from large populations followed over many years. What's weaker is any claim that one specific food or diet guarantees a longer life. Diet is tangled up with income, culture, activity, and access, and it's nearly impossible to isolate. So the honest takeaway isn't to chase a miracle ingredient. It's that people who age well tend to eat ordinary, mostly simple food, in reasonable amounts, without treating any single meal as either poison or medicine. And they rarely stop cooking and eating with other people, which quietly ties food and connection together. Number 7. They never stop keeping a daily rhythm. This one is quieter than the others, but it shows up again and again. The oldest adults tend to live by a fairly steady daily pattern. They wake around the same time, spend real time outdoors in natural light, stay active during the day, and wind down at night. Our bodies run on an internal clock, the circadian rhythm, that governs sleep, hormones, and energy, and it depends heavily on regular light and routine to stay aligned. When that rhythm holds, sleep tends to be steadier, and steady sleep is linked with better mood, memory, and physical recovery. What you don't often see in long-lived people is the modern pattern of scattered days, late screens, and irregular nights. Instead, there's a kind of gentle predictability. Morning light, movement, meals at regular times, rest when it's dark. Now, sleep does change naturally with age, and older adults often sleep a little lighter, so this isn't about forcing a perfect 8 hours. It's about the rhythm itself, the steady rise and fall of a day that has shape. And that structure ties back to almost everything else here, because a predictable day makes movement, meals, and connection easier to keep doing without having to decide to. So step back and look at the whole picture, and something becomes clear. None of these 7 things is dramatic. There's no biohack here, no secret supplement, and no extreme regimen, And that's exactly the point. What connects them is regularity, not intensity. The people who reach very old age in good shape didn't win through bursts of heroic effort. They won, if that's even the right word, through decades of ordinary consistency. Look closer, and you'll notice how tightly these habits are woven together. Movement isn't separate from purpose, because having a reason to get up is what gets you moving. Connection isn't separate from food, because meals are so often shared. A steady daily rhythm makes all the other habits easier, because you're not deciding each morning whether to walk or call a friend. You simply do, the way you always have. That interlocking quality may be more important than any single habit. It's not that these people found 7 tricks, it's that they built lives where good behaviors happened almost automatically, driven by relationships, routines, and environments rather than willpower. And notice what's missing from the list. Perfection. Many long-lived people had rough patches, bad habits, and hard years. What they tended to share wasn't flawless living. It was a set of steady patterns that kept them moving, connected, fed, rested, and engaged year after year without ever framing it as a plan. Now let's be honest about the evidence, because that's where a lot of longevity content falls apart. Not all of these patterns rest on the same quality of proof. The strongest evidence, by far, is for physical activity and for muscle-preserving effort. Those have been tested not just in observational studies, which track people over time, but in randomized trials, where researchers actually assign the activity and measure what happens. That kind of study is much better at showing cause and effect. For diet, the evidence is solid, but mostly observational, built from watching large populations over decades. It strongly suggests that plant-forward, moderate eating supports healthier aging, but it can't perfectly separate food from everything else in a person's life. For social connection, purpose, mental engagement, and daily rhythm, the evidence is real but softer, and it leans heavily on observation. That means we keep running into the same problem, confounding, where several things move together and we can't cleanly pull them apart. And then there's the deepest issue of all when you study centenarians. Survivor bias. By definition, these people made it. We're looking at the winners and trying to reverse engineer why they won, but we never get to see everyone who did the same things and died earlier anyway. Some centenarians smoked, drank, or lived under heavy stress, and survived despite it, not because of it. One remarkable person proves nothing about what works for everyone. Studying this group is genuinely hard for other reasons too. There aren't many centenarians to begin with. Memories of a lifetime of habits are unreliable, and in some places, old age records were never carefully kept, which can even blur exactly how old people really are. Genetics clearly matter as well, and researchers believe inherited factors count for more and more the older you get. So the fair conclusion is this: these 7 patterns are consistently associated with healthy aging, some with strong evidence and some with weaker evidence, and together they point toward how function is preserved. But they're patterns to understand, not guarantees to buy. So where do people go wrong with all of this? The biggest mistake is chasing the shiny object. People see a documentary about a long-lived village and immediately want the one food, the one supplement, the one ritual, while ignoring the whole life it sits inside. But you can't pull a single tile and expect the mosaic. The habits work as a system, not as isolated tricks. Another common error is confusing thinness with health, or assuming that because someone very old smoked or drank, those things must be safe. They're not. An exception doesn't erase a well-established risk. It just reminds us that biology is complicated and that a few people beat long odds. People also tend to reach for supplements before fixing the basics, spending money on pills while skipping the walk, the phone call, and the regular bedtime that actually have evidence behind them. And maybe the most important mistake is thinking longevity requires perfect discipline. It doesn't. The people who age well aren't grinding through a strict protocol. They're living inside comfortable routines that make good choices feel normal. Finally, a lot of people focus only on the number of years and forget the quality of those years. Reaching 100 while bedbound and isolated is not the goal most of us actually have. Staying strong, clear, and connected is. So what does all of this really tell us? Step back far enough and the lesson isn't about reaching a specific age at all. It's about what keeps a body and mind working for as long as possible. Strength, so you can move through the world on your own. Mobility and balance, so a stumble doesn't become a broken hip and a lost decade. A mind that stays engaged, relationships that stay alive, and a reason to keep taking part in your own life. These 7 things people never stop doing after 80 aren't really about defeating death. They're about protecting function, the ability to keep living fully right up until the end. And here's what's genuinely encouraging. Almost none of it depends on being wealthy, or having perfect genes, or discovering something exotic. It depends far more on the shape of your ordinary days, on whether movement, connection, purpose, and rest are simply built into how you live. Longevity, for most people who reach it well, isn't the product of one heroic decision. It's the product of a life quietly arranged so that the healthy thing is also the easy thing. That's the deeper pattern behind every item on this list. Not 7 separate secrets. One way of living that keeps a person in the game. So here's what to hold on to. The people who reach very old age in a good shape almost never suddenly transformed themselves at 80. They simply refused to stop. They kept moving, kept challenging their bodies, kept people close, kept a reason to rise, kept their minds working, kept eating simply, and kept a steady daily rhythm. Some of that is backed by strong science. Some rests on softer evidence and honest uncertainty. And none of it is a promise that you personally will reach 100. But that was never really the point. Even if you never see triple digits, these are the habits that tend to protect the years you do get. The strength, the clarity, the connection, the independence. Longevity may be the headline. Function is the real story. And the encouraging truth is that the most powerful thing you can do isn't to start something dramatic. It's to take the good things you're already doing and simply never stop. If this helped you see aging a little more clearly, you can like the video and subscribe to the 100-Year Life for more evidence-based stories about living longer, stronger, and better.